So as we go through, what you'll hear are the calls of each species as we run through them. And I suppose the main aim of today's presentation is to give an overview or a brief introduction to most of the frogs of the Yarra ranges, but not only limited to the Yarra ranges, but obviously a lot of the species that I'll be talking about occur a bit more broadly in the Greater Melbourne area. Some are a bit more specific, a bit more restricted, and we'll talk about where those species can be found. And they all have slightly different habitat preferences, even if they share the same broader habitat. You have different species preferring different microhabitats, if you like, or areas within those broader habitats that they go about their daily lives, whether it's for mating, laying eggs, or even where their tadpoles necessarily like to hang out. But we'll also cover a bit on their conservation. So while many of the frogs that I'll talk about are still relatively common in the area, there are a couple of species that have been introduced fairly recently, and a couple of species that are threatened, and a few that aren't threatened, at least at the state or national level, but that are, if you like, of local significance. They might have declined regionally, so they're of a more local conservation interest. Okay, so the only trick is I can't hear these sounds playing, but I'll trust that you can. Okay, so this is one that a lot of you are probably already familiar with, not least of all because it's one of the most abundant species across all of the Melbourne area, and more broadly in Victoria, the common froglet, but only a small frog, despite the loud call. And how big? So pushing maybe only a couple of centimetres, not too much larger than that, although maybe occasionally. And the tricky thing about common froglet is that they're one of the most variable of the local frogs, but not only in their colour and pattern, like you can see here. So you get all sorts of different colours and patterns, although mostly obviously shades of brown, maybe with a bit of a green tinge sometimes, and patterns ranging from spots to stripes, completely plainly patterned individuals. But they also vary in their skin texture. So you can get common froglets that are completely warty, or that have raised ridges along their back, or that are completely smooth skinned. And you can get all that variation coming from a single clutch. So they make it nice and confusing for us when we're trying to tell them apart. Luckily for us though, at least within the Yarra ranges, this is the only small frog in this genus, or in the genus they belong to, Crinia. There are a couple of other small frog species that you might confuse with them, but for the most part, you know, the general appearance more broadly, so they've kind of got a pointed snout. They often, despite the pattern varying a bit, more often than not, they've got barring stripes on the back legs, and often black markings on their lip, on the upper lip. You can see there's kind of darker triangular markings that often give you a clue that they're a common froglet, as opposed to some of the other species that I'll show you. But as you can see in the top left corner, not only variable in their dorsal or their back patterns, but their ventral or belly pattern. Although broadly, they've got black and white marbling on the belly. So even though it's a bit variable, it can still be useful to distinguish this species from some of the others. Obviously, if you ask them nicely to roll over, which can be tricky for obvious reasons. So hopefully that call's played for you, which sounds obviously very different from the common froglet. But this species isn't much larger, maybe only slightly, so you know, approaching 3 centimetres at the most. And like the common froglet, it's got those dark markings on the lips, usually, and often the black bandings or barring on the legs. But like the common froglet, very variable in colour at least. So as opposed to this more yellow individual or yellow and light brown, you get ones that are dark brown, or even with white sort of mottled markings, and even a bit of a pink or purple hue, diffusion or speckling on the body. But unlike the common froglet, this species is unusual not only in its distinctive call, but the fact that it lays its eggs on land. So all our frogs, maybe with the exception of this and another species, lay their eggs in water, as you'd expect. But this is one of the 2 mainly autumn breeding frogs. So as we head into later March through April and early May, although this species, it's a bit more broader in terms of when it might breed. So you might get them breeding a bit earlier and or later than that. They lay their eggs in shallow depressions or drainage lines that flood seasonally. So in this case, we'd expect that they'd flood in winter and spring. And it takes about that long for the tadpoles to develop after the eggs hatch. So the rising water level in those dry depressions or drainage lines stimulates the eggs to hatch once they're covered by water. But the tadpoles take up to 6 months, give or take, to complete their development. So it's a bit of a risky strategy for them because they're relying on the water to remain at those sites well into spring, potentially into the second half of spring, hoping that they won't dry out before the tadpoles have a chance to finish their development and emerge. But it's worth mentioning the call of this species as well. So I'll see if we can play it again. Hopefully that works. So you should be able to hear, there are 2 very distinctive parts to the call. The first part's a bit of a rant or a run-up, sort of a drawn-out, raspy sort of note. And the second part of the call obviously consists of those chirps or pips, obviously a much shorter note. And Murray Littlejohn, who's fairly enough considered one of the modern fathers of frog biology in Australia, and in many ways a pioneer of understanding frog acoustics, frog calls, not only in Australia, but globally in many respects. He was able to decipher, to figure out the meaning of those two call components of this species. And what he discovered was that the first part of the call, that ramp, the longer notes, only targeted towards other males. So it purely has a territorial function, telling the other boys to stay out of their patch. And I should say that it's only the male frogs that are calling, or at least making the calls that we recognise as frog calls. The second part of the call serves a completely different function. It's only directed to females. So being that it's only the male frogs that are calling, yes, they're calling to attract a mate, but they're also calling to deter other males or flag their own territory, and as a bit of a warning. So that second part, the pip call, the pip, 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 is only directed, as I said, to the females. And they don't necessarily have to emit both parts of that call at the same time. So depending on their intentions, they can only signal to the males or just the females. And we should probably mention that some male frogs are really naughty, and they don't, or they can call, obviously, but they might choose not to. And instead, they use a strategy that gives them the name satellite males. So what they're doing is hanging around other males that are calling, so that they can save their own energy. And then when a female's attracted to the other male that's calling, that the satellite male's hanging around, they'll intercept the female before she gets to the male that's doing all the work. So arguably not a very fair strategy. And maybe there are some ways that frogs are similar to some humans, but I won't say anything else about that. Okay, so this is the other species that, like the Victorian smooth froglet, the last one that we looked at, breeds mainly in autumn. And it's even a little bit more specific in terms of the timing of its breeding than that Victorian smooth froglet. So we're really looking at April as being the core breeding time for the southern toadlet. Although usually starting a bit earlier than that, depending on the weather mainly, and the season, rainfall, apart from temperature and anything else. So we'd expect, all being well, that they start breeding in a few weeks toward the end of March. Sorry. And the breeding strategy of this frog, more so than the Victorian smooth froglets, landed in a bit of trouble. Or I should say rather that climate change potentially is landing this frog into more and more trouble with the increasing frequency and duration of droughts. So there are obviously a few potential threats towards frogs, and some are more important for some species than others. In this case, because of this species breeding strategy, laying its eggs in dry areas that are dry in autumn, and then relying on winter and spring rainfall to fill those breeding sites. And then this species taking at least 6 months to complete its development, occasionally a bit longer than that. We wouldn't expect that the tadpoles are finishing their development into a frog and leaving those breeding sites until usually later in November. And the unfortunate thing is, obviously with climate change and increasing drought pressure, those breeding sites aren't holding water often for all that time, or for that length of time, and they're drying up prematurely, which is why this species is now considered endangered in Victoria, at least at the state level. And Victoria is the core of this species distribution, although it is also found in Tasmania, and maybe the very far southeast corner of South Australia. This one's a little bit luckier. So it's a call that many of you probably recognise. Along with the common froglet, one of the small handful of frogs in the Greater Melbourne area, let alone the Yarra ranges, that are still fairly abundant. Although maybe a little further to the west than the east. So it's fair to say that spotted marsh frog have a bit of a preference for the ever so slightly drier habitats, as opposed to one of its close relatives, which I'll show you next. But something that confuses people occasionally is the fact that you get spotted marsh frogs with a stripe down the middle of the back. That stripe down the back doesn't make it a striped marsh frog. So the important part of the frog that we're looking at to be able to identify it are the spots to either side of the back, you know, and on the sides of the body are what make it a spotted marsh frog. And that stripe down the centre of the back's variable. It can be there and it cannot be there. It's inconsequential. So it doesn't really mean anything. It's just variation, you know, within the populations of this species. And so they're not terribly fussy about the sites that they're breeding at, whether they're necessarily more permanent in terms of how long the water's hanging around for, or more temporary. So they take a shorter time, although still usually a few weeks, if not months, for the tadpoles to develop into a frog. As opposed to its close relative, the striped marsh frog. So again, they can have a pale, narrow stripe down the middle of the back, but they can also not have that stripe down the middle of the back. Like in the spotted marsh frog, it's a variable feature. It can be there or it cannot be there. Inconsequential, but the stripes that make it a striped marsh frog are these broader, darker stripes to either side of that. And the call you would have noticed similar to that of the previous species, spotted marsh frog, but it's, if anything, a little bit deeper. So some people compare striped marsh frog, this one, maybe to a hen clucking, or something that occasionally helps people remember, like the grain on timber. If you get a couple of lumps of wood and knock them together, it makes a sound not unlike that of this striped marsh frog. And if we go back to spotted marsh frog and play that call again, it's higher-pitched, maybe like two rocks or pebbles being knocked together. So hence the spots, obviously round, shaped like a rock or a pebble on the spotted marsh frog. So if you can remember, round spots on the spotted marsh frog, like round rocks or pebbles being knocked together, compared to the stripes on the striped marsh frog, like the grain on two bits of wood being knocked together. And that's a trick that we teach to school kids. I do a little bit of education work at La Trobe Uni's Wildlife Sanctuary, and it often helps the kids to remember, let alone the adults, kids and adults alike. Because otherwise, even for people who are more familiar with the calls of these two marsh frogs, the calls are that close and sound similar enough, often enough, that even we occasionally get them confused. Okay, and this tends to be a favourite for people, maybe for obvious reasons. So the pobblebonk or banjo frog, which is related to the striped and spotted marsh frogs. It's in the same genus, so closely related, technically a type of marsh frog. But unlike the spotted and striped marsh frog, pobblebonk has a nifty strategy for avoiding drying out. So obviously, being a frog, like all or the vast majority of frogs, they've got to maintain a moist skin pretty much constantly. But pobblebonks are a fantastic burrower. So people often dig them up in the garden or the compost. And some of you probably have, or you'd be familiar with pobblebonks because of that. So it means that they can go a fair distance away from water. So they're fantastic overland travellers. And when it's dry, they can, so they mainly move at night to avoid drying out. And then, like most frogs, they're nocturnal, so mainly active at night. During the day, they'll get under rocks, under logs, under leaf litter, burrow into loose soil to prevent them from drying out. Having said that, though, they still have to breed in standing water, like the striped and spotted marsh frog. So they're always tied back to water, at least for their breeding. And the tadpoles of this species, although they often develop within the same season that the eggs are laid, for this species being mainly spring and summer, they can overwinter. So occasionally, if the eggs are laid later into summer, there won't be enough time necessarily for the tadpoles to finish their development before winter comes around. So it might be that the tadpoles end up spending the better part, if not a whole year, in the water. And the tadpoles of this species are really big. So they're a big frog, big tadpole, 7 centimetres, maybe a bit bigger for a large female pobblebonk. And the tadpoles, if you ever see large dark tadpoles, chances are, if it's not a pobblebonk, then it might be the striped marsh frog, because they also have large, usually very dark tadpoles. Tadpoles obviously aren't as easy necessarily to identify as what they are when they turn into frogs. But if anything, pobblebonk or banjo frog tadpoles usually have a little bit of patterning on them, whereas the striped marsh frog tadpoles are a bit plainer and usually a bit darker. Now, I threw this in here at the last minute because everyone loves a pobblebonk, but apart from that fact, there is something going on with the appearance of pobblebonks that often confuses people. And it's that we have different subspecies. So I don't blame people who necessarily get confused or if this goes over a lot of our heads, because when you get into the differences between subspecies, let alone species, it gets even more confusing, maybe unsurprisingly, in terms of what they look like, what they sound like, or any other differences for that matter. But it's probably one worth mentioning because in the Yarra Ranges, there is a particular type or subspecies of pobblebonk that's more common than the other. And it's the one that I previously showed you. So if we go back to the previous slide quickly, you can see the more common of the local subspecies of pobblebonk. And we give that subspecies a name, or it's given a name, the southern banjo frog, because strangely enough, it's more common in the South Victoria, but more the southeast. So the Yarra Ranges is almost at the sort of a very broad boundary where this subspecies of pobblebonk, the southern banjo frog, starts to become much more common. And the further east you go, the sort of more common this species tends to be, and less so the other subspecies, which is the one on the next slide. But before we point out the difference with that one, the distinguishing features of this southern banjo frog are the fact that it does have a thin, pale stripe down the middle of the back. So while that stripe's inconsequential for the spotted and the striped marsh frog, it's an important characteristic in this southern banjo frog to tell it apart from the other banjo frog subspecies, or at least that occur in the Yarra Ranges. So that, as I say, that pale stripe is a key characteristic. But also on the lower sides of the body, it's got a little bit of marbled patterning, but it's a sort of a bluey grey colour or variation. There isn't much orange or yellow patterning going on the side of the body, as opposed to the other subspecies. Eastern banjo frog, which is more common in the west of Melbourne, also occurs in the Yarra Ranges, but a little bit less commonly. So this subspecies tends to drop out the further that you go east of Melbourne. And they do have yellow, or a bit of orange patterning on the side of the body, and not much of a stripe down the middle of the back. So it's largely absent in this one. Okay, a very different frog altogether. So moving into the tree frogs, although despite being a tree frog, you wouldn't expect this species to be found in trees. And in fact, it's almost entirely terrestrial, but it loves rocks. So the leisure's or rocky river frog, it's a bit of a stream breeding specialist. So creeks or rivers, but often with a rocky substrate, pebbles or cobbles, or even bouldery sort of streams. And so you probably wonder where in the Yarra Ranges then would you expect to see it, and exactly in those sorts of situations. So the upper Yarra catchment is where at least leisure's or the rocky river frog used to be found. And I say used to be found because up to around 2012, one of the fairly well-known rangers in Parks Victoria, Cam Beardsell, who's a bit of an all-round gun naturalist. He's a bit of a guru, not just on frogs, but all sorts of things. He recognised that this species was present in the upper Yarra, so including the Watts River. So if any of you are familiar with the Watts River up around Mount Juliet, and some of the creeks that come off the Yarra around Warburton, like Yankee Jim's Creek, these are the areas where Rocky River or Leisure's frog was known from, at least up until that time. But also, strangely enough, historically, further down the Yarra catchment into Wonga Park and Warrandyte, so along Watson's Creek and the Yering Gorge. But as far as we know, they're gone from that sort of middle Yarra catchment area. And we're unsure as to whether it still occurs in the upper Yarra. And myself and a couple of students from La Trobe Uni went looking for this species a couple of years ago, and we put up remote sound recorders in some of those areas to try and record it in an effort to figure out where it's still hanging around. And I'm ashamed to say we haven't quite got to listening to those recordings yet. So if anyone's a bit of a sucker for punishment or might be interested in listening to potentially hundreds of hours of recordings of running water in the upper Yarra catchment and trying to pick out the fairly soft call of this species, get in touch and we might be able to figure something out. But it's interesting mentioning the soft call of this one, because the thought is that it's actually losing its ability, evolving over time to rely less on calling to attract a mate and to ward off other males. And what the males are doing instead, or in addition, in the meantime, is turning bright yellow during breeding as a visual signal, potentially, to the females that they're there and ready to mate. And then that yellow colour, it's very, what's the word? So they transition very quickly from yellow to brown. So even within the breeding season, or at different times of day, they'll change colour. And being mainly nocturnal, it's mainly at night that they're this bright yellow colour. One of my favourites, and I think for a lot of people probably share the same opinion of this frog. Like the pobblebonk, it's one of the larger ones, if not about the largest frog in the Greater Melbourne area. So pushing maybe not quite 10 centimetres, although large females can almost get to that size. Females, for most frogs, tending to be, although maybe not all, tending to be larger than what the adult males are. Unfortunately for this species, unlike the pobblebonk or banjo frog, it's threatened, so vulnerable not only in Victoria but nationally. And unfortunately, all of these dots that you can see on the map of the Yarra Ranges, where this species was historically recorded, just about all of those, or at least a vast majority, are historic and no longer extant. So they don't exist, as far as we know, at any of these places anymore, unfortunately. Having said that, though, really interestingly, the growling grass frog turned up for the first time in about, 20 years, around Coldstream. So in the catchment of Stringybark Creek, only a couple of years ago. So it would have been around the summer of, the start of 2020, I think. On private property, most of the water bodies in that Coldstream and Gruyere sort of area are on private property. So not the easiest access, but it was actually some arborists, believe it or not, doing tree assessments, who visited one of these properties, obviously to assess some trees, but they obviously had a bit of knowledge of frogs, at least enough to identify that there were growling grass frogs calling from one of the dams on this particular property. And it created a lot of excitement because although there are occasional reports of growling grass frogs from landowners in the area, it was one of only a couple of relatively recent recordings of the growling grass frog, as I say, within the past couple of decades from that area. So if anyone thinks they might have seen or heard the growling grass frog and you live in the area, it's one that council, let alone Melbourne Water and others, would be, I think safe to say, very interested in knowing about and potentially following up. The reason that this species has declined as much as it has, so as I said, other was the foothills to the east of Melbourne, Yarra Ranges more broadly, most of the sedimentary or Silurian creeks and rivers and catchments to the north and east of Melbourne. But also it was thought until recently the Mornington Peninsula. Those are the areas where you no longer find these species. Funnily enough, they've also reappeared on the Mornington Peninsula recently. So they're one that, even though they're a large frog, they're still fairly cryptic, or they've got the ability to hang around in the landscape maybe without being detected or without being found for long periods of time, which is interesting. But it's often through the frog census that, or citizen scientists, people going out and recording frogs that end up detecting, if not rediscovering, populations of this species. And it's a fungus that's thought to have been the main cause of the growling grass frog's decline. Chytrid fungus. And many of you, or some of you at least, have probably heard of it. And it's been in the media a little bit more recently because it's probably the cause, or thought to be part of the cause at least, of the mass frog declines up the east coast of Australia. So there's been a lot of reporting out of New South Wales and parts of Queensland, but also other parts of Australia, including parts of Victoria, where there have been mass declines of frogs particularly recently, or this through the past year, particularly. And chytrid fungus, this introduced fungus, which attacks the frog's skin. So it's a horrible disease for a frog, given, you know, how reliant they are on their skin, not only for the same reasons that we're reliant on ours, you know, as a barrier to infection and all the rest of it, but frogs also breathe through their skin, at least in part. So depending on the species, it's very variable, but maybe 20%, give or take, of a frog's oxygen comes through its skin. And one of the reasons why they need to maintain moist skins. So a fungal disease that attacks the frog's skin is obviously going to be a devastating one. And it's resulted in the extinction of a handful of frogs and the decline of many others, including the growling grass frog. Okay, one that people a lot of people are probably more personally familiar with because along with some of the others like the pobblebonk and spotted marsh and common froglet, the southern brown tree frog often gets around, but it's a good colonizer of artificial water bodies, including swimming pools. And being a tree frog, they've got sticky pads on their fingers and toes, which obviously gives them the ability to climb surfaces, including smooth surfaces like windows and downpipes. And they'll get up into pot plants. But it means that for anyone who's got a swimming pool and lets it turn nice and green and slimy with algae in the winter, which is part of the year, not the only part of the year, but part of the year when this species is breeding, and you get frogs laying eggs in your pool, chances are that it might be the southern brown tree frog. And obviously they're able to get out because of that climbing ability, whereas some of the other frogs, like the banjo frog, have a bit more trouble, and they might end up, if they're lucky, being pulled out, if not stuck in the filter box. But southern brown tree frog, as I say, they're not just breeding in winter. They're one of the few frogs in the Melbourne area, the other main one being the common froglet, that can breed all year round, potentially, although maybe with peaks in autumn and spring, or at least early spring. But as I say, through winter and then maybe not so much in summer. This frog is susceptible to chytrid fungus. So they'll die from chytrid infection, but they're still very common. And part of the reason for that thought to be because they can breed at all times of year, and chytrid is more prevalent, or there's a lot more chytrid around during winter. It prefers cooler temperatures, chytrid fungus. And this frog breeds so quickly and matures so rapidly that they can breed really quickly and breed, as I say, at all times of year. And that rapid breeding cycle possibly overcomes the most devastating impacts from chytrid fungus, in that chytrid wouldn't be able to kill off the entire population in winter, for example, before the tadpoles have a chance to finish their development and then potentially breed at the slightly warmer time of year and mature quickly enough to breed again. A very closely related species. So we're just about to the end, but probably worth saying that although it sounds very similar to the southern brown tree frog, the call of the whistling tree frogs a bit higher pitched, but they're closely related enough that these two species are now known to hybridize. So they make identifying themselves even more fun because not only do they end up sounding more like each other, but they look more similar to each other as well. But one of the main ways of telling them apart is that the whistling tree frog usually has these black blotches or markings in the groin. So you can just see the marking from most of it's hidden by the folded back leg, but on the rear side of the body. Whereas if we go back to our southern brown tree frog, they might have a little bit of black flecking in the groin or the lower side, half of the side of the body, but not black or larger black markings like what the whistling tree frog has. Also, although it's nowhere near as reliable, more often than not, whistling tree frogs have a divided back patch. So they've got a black rectangle or marking very, very broad going down the top of the back. In the brown tree frog, not always, but often that patch is entire. There's no gap in the middle of it. Whereas on the whistling tree frog, again, not always, but often, there's a division. So you get this broad, pale stripe down the middle of the back. But as I say, that's nowhere near always reliable. You get plenty of whistling tree frogs that have a bit of a connected back patch, although usually partly divided, and you'll get brown tree frogs that have a largely divided back patch occasionally as well. And to finish off, we've got a couple of frogs that may be surprisingly, at least for those of us who weren't already aware, are introduced to the Melbourne area. And they include Perrin's tree frog, also known as the emerald spotted tree frog, because although it's hard to see, they've got very small green spots on the back and the head and the legs, but also very appropriately called the maniacal cackle frog. And they're an easy one to identify and distinguish from other frogs in the Melbourne area, also because they've got cross-shaped pupils. They're the only frog that we have in Melbourne that has a cross-shaped pupil, like a crazy maniacal clown. So that's a good way to remember its other name, maniacal cackle frog. But they're larger than our truly indigenous or local tree frogs. So pushing 5 centimetres, and they've got really big sticky pads on their fingers and toes, being a tree frog, but also, as all good tree frogs arguably should do, this one does actually climb trees, whereas the local tree frogs, being the brown and the whistling tree frog, are mainly climbing sedges and rushes, lower growing plants. But Perrin's tree frog, with those really big sticky discs on its fingers and toes, can climb right up into trees. They often get under bark, but they'll even take shelter in tree hollows, and they'll get right up into the canopy. So if they're introduced to the Melbourne area, which is a bit of a dampener on this species, because it's a bit of a bummer, because they're really a really pretty frog, a really impressive frog, although I'm obviously biased, but they're one that a lot of people are becoming increasingly familiar with. But they are increasing their local distribution in Melbourne, whereas all the other frogs are either remaining as common as they are, they're not changing much in their populations, or they're declining. Perrin's tree frog's probably the only one that's going in the opposite direction. It's becoming a lot more common. So where are they introduced from then? Not from far away. So they're mainly a frog from north of the divide. So the north side of the Great Dividing Range, along the Murray River and the subcatchments of the Murray, but also Gippsland. And they first turned up in Melbourne in the mid-80s, 1985 at Yanyeen Reservoir. So Murray Littlejohn, who I mentioned, he and a colleague of his were the ones who first discovered a Perrin's tree frog in Melbourne at that time. Since then, it's expanded in its range enormously, and now also into Western Victoria. How much of a problem, if any, that might be for our local frogs is a good question, and one that we don't know the answer to. As I say, they're in their own particular niche in terms of their climbing ability. There aren't really any frogs that are sharing that tree or canopy habitat with this species. Having said that though, they do hang around much closer to the ground in lower growing vegetation, so they're not that fussy, and they'll be on rocks and logs, and like most of the frogs in Melbourne and the Yarra Ranges, they still have a requirement to come back to water to breed. You know, so the tadpoles are potentially in competition with other tadpoles of our indigenous frogs. But as I say, we don't really know otherwise what impact this species might be having. And this is the last of them. And the other one that's introduced from a bit further afield. So the eastern dwarf tree frog naturally doesn't occur much further south of Wollongong, or a little bit further south of there, but not too much. But it's expanded its distribution into further south in the southeast coast of New South Wales, but also within the Melbourne area, since it was initially discovered in the southeast, trying to think of the area, but around Braeside, that sort of area a couple of decades ago, or in the early 2000s. Since then, it's turned up in the Yarra catchment, and it's continuing its expansion both upstream and downstream. So it initially turned up in the Wonga Park area, but it's becoming increasingly common and now encroaching. Well, it's been known to occur in the municipality for a while now, and it's although you can't see those sites on the map, there should be sites around Lilydale and Moorobark, that sort of area, and potentially now they're, as I say, increasingly heading up the Yarra. And again, like for Perrin's tree frog, we don't really know what impact this species might be having, although there is potential for a project to be run through the University of Melbourne. So there's a frog research group at the University of Melbourne that has some funding currently to launch a project looking at what impact this eastern dwarf tree frog might be having on our local species. So hopefully if they can entice a student to take on that project, we might find out fairly soon, fingers crossed. But it is unfortunate again, though, because they are arguably a nice frog to have around. Otherwise, they're one of the few, well, apart from the growling grass frog, the only other really green frog that we now have in the Melbourne area. Okay, so very quickly, to recap, where are we necessarily going to come across these frogs around a wetland in terms of where they're hanging out and calling apart from anything else? So Perrin's tree frog, as I say, they've got that climbing ability. So able to climb, usually at a height higher than our other local indigenous tree frogs. Whereas the brown and the whistling tree frogs are usually, as I said, hanging around in the rushes and sedges around the edge of a wetland, but climbing other plants as well. They might get up trees, but not usually really high. So, you know, a couple of meters off the ground, and maybe also hide under the bark. But they'll also get into and under logs and rocks around the edge of the wetland. The marsh frogs are usually calling and mating and laying their eggs in the water, but among emergent vegetation. So water plants that are rooted in the water, but often sticking just above. But they're not usually that specific anyway. So you find them hanging around the shallower edges of the wetland. And again, they'll be foraging on land. But those are the sort of sites that they're usually calling from in the water. And common froglet, being only a very small frog, it doesn't take much cover to conceal them. So they're often calling from the very shallow edges of the wetland and the shorter bog vegetation growing in the mud around the fringes. Victorian smooth froglet. So we mentioned that this is one of the couple of species that lays its eggs on land, and often, although not always, targeting clumps of vegetation for protection apart from anything else. So tussocks of grass or rushes or sedges in areas, as I say, that don't have water in them at the time that the eggs are laid. And these are the sites that flood with the winter and spring rains. And the other species, the threatened one that also shares this breeding strategy I mentioned, is southern toadlet. Okay, and apart from that, that brings us to the end. There are a few references, books and websites, including Melbourne Water's Frog Census website. The one I haven't got up here that is becoming increasingly popular and that a lot of people are familiar with now is the Australian Museum's Frog ID website. But both Melbourne Water's Frog Census website and the museum's Frog ID website and the apps. So, you know, for Android and iPhone, you can get those Frog Census and Frog ID apps. And the convenient thing about those, apart from allowing you to record frog calls and then submit them to Melbourne Water or the Australian Museum to have them identified, those apps also have call recordings. They've got reference calls on them, so you can look up the different species of frogs and play their calls to familiarise yourself with them, or as a refresher when you're out recording frog calls and you want to compare or you remind yourself what they sound like. And that brings us to the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really enjoyed it. There's so much detail. I feel like sort of overwhelmed, just so much frog knowledge now, but absolutely loved it. Particularly really excited about hearing the growling grass frog in Coldstream a couple of years ago. So that's really, really brilliant. So yeah, I'm going to have to sort of do a bit more research about that. And I know that in the chat, we've had our Yarra Rangers Land Care Network, in the Q&A, I mean, have said that they're actually trying to form a land care group in Growling. So if anyone is in that area, in the Growling or sort of Coldstream area, and is interested in joining the Yarra Rangers, that land care group, they'd be really keen to do a bit of a survey for the species. So if you're interested, do get in touch with the Yarra Rangers Land Care Network, because they'd be really keen to hear from you. And yeah, potentially if you can do a bit of a survey, then we might see if we can find any others, which would be fantastic.
Absolutely. And so in fact, Jen, I think it's Amanda Smith, maybe, that I think she, from memory, yeah, Amanda might be the one who's aware of that record and was keen. Yeah, I think Amanda is keen to get something started as well. So within council. So yeah, I can't necessarily speak for council, but given the interest, and I know that James Fraser at Melbourne Water as well was interested in maybe seeing if we can get something started with, you know, the local land care networks and others. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, if anyone here is interested, you'll obviously get my email, and you can contact me at environmentalvolunteers@yarrarangers.vic.gov.au. So if you are wanting to do some sort of any citizen science in any of these areas, but particularly for the growling grass frog, do shoot me an email. You'll get that email in when you get the follow-up email in a couple of days' time. But we do have some questions coming in. Please, everyone, if you've got any other questions, we've got about 20 minutes left. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. And the other great thing about the Q&A is it does give you a little thumbs up icon. So if there's a question that you can see already there and you really want that one answered, give it a thumbs up, and then that shoots it to the top of my screen, so I'm more likely to see it. So we'll just kind of go through some of these now. So one person, well, actually from the Yarra Rangers Network, wanted to know the maps that you had, that you displayed on each frog. Are they from the Atlas of Living Australia? Are they kind of verified by that? Do you know? Yeah,
they are. Yeah. So, well, just so quickly to explain, the Atlas of Living Australia, I won't go into it in detail because a lot of us are probably already aware of it and what it does. But it's you know, it's one of these what's becoming an increasingly popular repository for records of plants and animals and wildlife. So it's a biodiversity record database. That the nice thing about the Atlas of Living Australia is that it includes records from all of the other online biodiversity databases, including ones like iNaturalist, which a lot of people are using because it's user-friendly, and you know, you can look at people's photos of what they've found and help other people identify things on there. There's the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, which is a bit more official, if for no other reason. It's the Victorian government's, you know, formal or official biodiversity database that they use to help inform management decisions on public and private land around the state. So, you know, that database is particularly critical as well in terms of, for example, the growling grass frogs at Coldstream, because it's an area that obviously rural, but there are some, developments around the fringes and, land being sold in some cases and subdivided or, transitioning between different types of agriculture. So when council, for example, or Department of Environment are making really critical planning decisions and there are threatened species involved like that, then the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas really comes into its own. So the Atlas of Living Australia includes all of those records. And the maps that I showed may be one of the reasons why some of the locations I mentioned, or where people might know that some of these frogs exist, but the records aren't shown or weren't shown on the maps that I had. For a couple of reasons. So they are a year or two old, those maps, but also it takes a while for these records to filter through from the various databases. So it can take a while for the Atlas of Living Australia to update. Yeah.
Excellent. And I should let people know, if anyone's interested in iNaturalist, we did actually have a webinar, I think last September, on how to use iNaturalist. So if you go to the Yarra Ranges, either our website or our YouTube channel, you can go back and find that iNaturalist for Beginners webinar and have a learn of that. And we will be having a biodiversity blitz this September. So I do encourage you to learn and be able to know how to go out and look for all the different types of frogs and creatures and things out there. We have a question here. Actually, I just want to remind everyone that yes, we are recording this webinar and it will be up on our website and our YouTube channel in a week or so. But someone wanted to know if they were able to get a copy of your presentation slides, David.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, we can. There's nothing on there that's terribly sensitive. Maybe depending on what the intention is or how widely they might, end up. But definitely we can look at that, and maybe I can send you, the slides in a PDF or something like that, Jen, depending on what they're after, so we can chat about that. Yeah,
absolutely. And like I said, because it's going to be recorded, maybe we'll stick with the recording for now. And if people are still interested or want to have a specific reason, you just send me an email and let me know the details, and then I can chat with David and we can sort of go from there. Yeah. Alison had a question about the introduced frogs, and she wanted to know: are they thought to be here because they're moving because of climate change, or are they escaped pets?
Really good question. So the short answer is it's hard to say, but we're fairly, so it's not, we can be fairly confident that it's not climate change, at least to the extent that they've expanded in their distribution to date. So they turned up fairly suddenly, and there's a large gap, well, at least a gap between where those couple of frogs, Perrin's tree frog and the eastern dwarf tree frog, there's a gap between where they occur naturally and where they've turned up in Melbourne, or at least there used to be. For the Perrin's tree frog, or the other names for that species, the emerald spotted or maniacal cackle frog, that gap is now reduced. So it may no longer be really existent because it wasn't introduced from far away. And, possibly through the Kilmore Gap, the divide in the Great Divide. So as it suggests, there is a break in the Great Dividing Range where it's thought species like the Perrin's tree frog might have been assisted, you know, through. So how might it have been assisted? Possibly unintentionally. So if we were to guess, because Perrin's tree frog particularly likes getting under bark and in hollows and hiding in timber, so firewood potentially, you know, from red gum from you know, the Murray catchment, or they'll also hide in plants. So they'll stow away in produce and you know, garden supplies and this sort of thing. But people obviously transport frogs around as well. So it's possible that there might have been some releases from, you know, people who have kept them as pets. The eastern dwarf tree frog, as I said, it's come from a bit further away, New South Wales and Queensland, and or Queensland, and they are a part of a group of frogs that are affectionately known as the banana box frogs. So for obvious reasons, so they find their way into produce, and they are a species that climbs, you know, a fair way up trees, and they'll get amongst bananas and you know, get into the mangoes and the various fruit and veg that comes from those, you know, parts of Australia. And often what you find is that people who come across them, once they find their way down to Melbourne, you know, may not necessarily know what they are or know what to do with them, and end up releasing them. So it's happened enough, obviously, that the eastern dwarf tree frog, although it naturally occurs from a slightly warmer climate, not warm enough that they can't survive and breed in Melbourne. So not as extreme as the cane toad, for example. So we don't have cane toads, at least, you know, they can't breed or survive in the long term, as far as we know, in Victoria. Although with increasing climate change, some people say, you know, way into the future, there could be potential for that. But for the moment, at least, they can't. But the eastern dwarf tree frog occurs much further south in New South Wales. So it's not that big a temperature difference that they can't survive here if they're released, or which is how we're pretty sure that they got here. Yeah.
So yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. That was very detailed. So many examples of just human interference, really, I think is the sort of short answer, really, isn't it? That the unfortunate accidental human interference can create some issues. And on that, Sue wanted to know if you can tell us a little bit more about the University of Melbourne project that you mentioned.
Yeah, so the lecturer's name is Kirsten Paris. So I mentioned that she runs a bit of a frog research group there, and she well, it's public knowledge, so it should be. So I have permission to say that they have funding to look at this project, investigating how or if the eastern dwarf tree frog might be impacting our local tree frogs or other frog species. But the particular focus for that project would be to look at their role in transporting around the chytrid fungus, because we know that eastern dwarf tree frog have some resistance to the fungus, but they can still carry it. And so, yeah, the large part of that project would look at, well, are they a risk to our other frogs that suffer from that fungus because they're transporting it around? You know, like a typhoid Mary of the frog world, or poor frogs, or might there be other impacts through competition, or yeah, something that we're not necessarily seeing going on. So there is funding, but what Kirsten is after at the moment is a keen student. So someone who's willing to do a project like that. So she's on the lookout, and if anyone's really interested, we can potentially put them in touch with Kirsten.
Absolutely, yeah. So if anyone knows anyone, do feel free to email me, and I'm happy to forward on to David, who will forward on to Kirsten. So yeah, we will be happy to make those introductions. And talking about the...
sorry, I should say it would be for a master's project, probably.
Okay, excellent.
If that makes any difference.
Good to know. And then we've got a question, actually. We're talking about the chytrid fungus. Loy wanted to know what mitigation is being done to control the fungus beside isolating infected areas.
A really tricky one and a good question. If for no other reason, it's a tricky one. So to mitigate chytrid fungus, there isn't an obvious or a main solution. To manage chytrid in the wild, you can treat individual infected frogs, in a lab or in a controlled environment. But in the wild, it's much harder. There are various things that are being looked at, ranging from, and some of them sound fairly far-fetched, but they're seriously being investigated. So everything from immunisations for frogs against the chytrid fungus to harnessing some of the microbes, the bacteria or that grows on some frogs' skin that might inhibit chytrid fungus, looking at how some frogs produce chemicals that inhibit the fungus, and looking at whether some frogs that are resistant within populations of the same species that aren't resistant more broadly, and maybe selectively breeding resistant frogs. That's even being looked at. But also habitat interventions. So I mentioned that chytrid fungus does well at cooler temperatures. So in some cases, if we have frogs, and the growling grass frog is a good example, that tolerate higher temperatures around a wetland, could there be things that we do that raise the temperature of the water or the surroundings of the wetland that make it less favourable for chytrid fungus, but the frogs can still tolerate? So things like putting in more rocks, which obviously heat up, when they're exposed to the sun, or not planting vegetation that's too tall or creates too much shading around the wetland so that it's hotter effectively. And in the case of the growling grass frog, they respond really well to that sort of intervention or habitat manipulation. So they don't mind it hot, but they do mind chytrid fungus. So you can make it thermally less favourable for the fungus. But also, just quickly, you can make it chemically less favourable for the fungus in the wetland as well. So particularly salinity. So salt inhibits chytrid, but growling grass frogs at least can tolerate a higher amount of salt to the point where it'll largely kill off, or at least...
Sorry, we lost your last sentence then. We got largely kill off and...
Oh, yeah. So at a certain level, an increased concentration of salt, salinity in the water, it'll kill off chytrid fungus, or at least manage it at a low level. But growling grass frogs can tolerate it. So I should say I should qualify that and say at what sort of level. So we're not talking anything near seawater. It's, maybe mid-range bore water. So you'd be able to taste the salt. It wouldn't be very nice to drink, but maybe what you would give to livestock, or at least dry sheep or something like that. Chemistry went over my head, but for anyone who's interested, around 3,000 parts per million. So whatever that is in electrical conductivity or the rest of it. So what does that mean? We're not necessarily going to start tipping salt into wetlands to manage chytrid fungus, but maybe when new wetlands for growling grass frogs are being created, we could look at filling them with bore water or maintaining them in a saltier state than what we might otherwise, at least for the growling grass frog. And it's not to say that it'll work for other frogs, which prefer, most of the other frogs around Melbourne do prefer slightly fresher conditions. We know that. But at least, so the solutions for chytrid, if we end up with solutions like this, they may be different for different frog species, very targeted. Yeah.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I had no idea there'd be so many different potential solutions when I asked that question. So really, thank you very much for that. That was really great detail. And we've got time for one last question from Sue, who wants to know, is it necessary to do surveys in the evening when recording calls only if you're aiming to identify every species present at a site across the year? Yeah. So are the evenings best, or is there other time of day that can work as well?
Yeah, and then frogs aren't great for people who don't like the night shifts. So unfortunately, I don't mind, because I'm just about nocturnal myself. So, and I don't know if frogs are mainly responsible for that, but so I did mention, and it's fair to say that practically all frogs are mainly active at night. There are a few minor exceptions, or I'll give you an example. Growling grass frogs often come out and bask during the day. The southern toadlet, the other threatened species I talked about, people often say, and they do often call during the day, but it's fair to say that they call more often at night. That's when they're doing most of their activity, whether it's mating or foraging or calling and all the rest of it. So if you wanted to, as the question suggested, get a really good idea of most of the frogs that are going to be in the area, you probably want to aim for night, after dark, because that's when you've got the greatest chance of recording the greatest number of frogs, given that they're all mostly active around that time. But it's not to say that you couldn't go to a wetland during the day and it might be going off with frogs. They might all be, occasionally you get almost as many, if not as many frogs calling during the day as what you might get at night. It depends on all sorts of other things like the weather, temperature, whether it's rained, the humidity and all the rest of it. Time of year, particularly. So you can my advice would be, try your luck during the day. And often it's obviously a useful thing, to go and check out a wetland or a site that you've never been to during the day before you visit at night, for your own, safety and knowledge of where you're going. But I would definitely, if you're able to, try and get there at night, and at different times of year. because different species are calling at different times of year. So, you know, ones like pobblebonk and the marsh frogs, mainly spring and into summer. The brown tree frog, the common froglet, maybe a bit more in winter, early spring and autumn. And then you've got your autumn specialists like the smooth froglet and the southern toadlet. So the more often you go out at night and at different times of year, the greater potential you have to get that, you know, full suite of species, or at least a good percentage of them anyway. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, David. That was absolutely brilliant. And, you know, it's just gone 11, so a little bit after 11:30 now, and we've finished all our questions. So I think just with that, I just want to say a huge thank you for your knowledge, your passion. I think a lot of people got a lot out of this. I've already had people asking me if it's being recorded because they want to send it to other people. So I'm really, really pleased. Thank you so much for all your information, your time this morning. And thank you to everyone for watching as well. So I hope you all enjoyed this. Recording will be up on our website within about a week or so. So if there's anything you missed, you can go back and have a look. But otherwise, I think I shall wrap it up there.
No worries. Thanks very much, Jen.
Thank you very much, David. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.